Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Privacy Podcast. I'm Ben Schiller with Maiden, and we have a great guest for you today. It's Yaya Fanusie. He's the Chief Policy Officer at Aleo, and he has a very interesting background. We're going to get into that with him. And welcome to the show, Yaya.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be here.
Great. So, as I say, you come from an interesting background. Is this atypical, probably, for the space? Although maybe blockchain space does have some interesting people from different backgrounds. So. Anyway, but you started at the CIA, I think, a few years ago.
Well, I didn't start there, but I was there.
That was a path.
I was not born in a CIA facility. I'm just messing with you. No. I mean, it depends on how far you want me to go back, but I think that does provide some context to my background because it was a while ago. This was actually in the 2000s, where I was hired at the CIA as an economic analyst, and then I soon went into the counterterrorism world. I was a counterterrorism analyst for several years. I worked at the CIA, at the agency, as we call it, for about 7 years. But I left in 2012. But the reason why I still talk about it to this day is it was a very formative part of my career, a big part of my career, being exposed to the national security space, Washington, D.C., working on national security threats. This was during the height of Al-Qaeda. And so, again, I left in 2012. But then when I was out of government, I started to focus on illicit finance. I was doing illicit finance research, doing some investigation, some consulting, and I landed at a think tank in the 2010s, basically 2015. And I was working on a project that looked at national security and economic issues. And they would focus on terrorist financing, sanctions evasion, a whole, things like that. And I was not exposed to Bitcoin or crypto. But in 2015, I heard people talking about it, and it was on the news. And I once saw a report that said ISIS is going to be using Bitcoin. ISIS is going to be using crypto. And I said, what is this Bitcoin? I started to learn more about it. And by 2016, across my desk, I actually had come across some, or at least one, terrorist financing campaign that was trying to do crowdfunding of crypto. This was in 2016, and this was my beginning. So my first exposure to crypto, unlike most people, was through illicit finance as a research area. It was through the policy question of how are bad actors going to use it. And I spent a few years with that as my portfolio, as my research and writing portfolio. I mean, actually, I think, Ben, if you go back, I know you used to be at CoinDesk. You could probably go back to the 2017s and 18s and 19s, and you will find CoinDesk articles or op-eds and interviews where I'm talking about some of these issues. But fast forward, what happened as I got more into crypto, I did develop a respect for and appreciation for the technology. I think anyone who deals with crypto, blockchain tech, you learn more about it. And, at this time, this was in 2016, 2017, the crypto space was very accessible. So I would go to conferences and I could meet, people that are building products, developers. So it wasn't like I was this outsider. I mean, I was a policy outsider DC guy, but I go to conferences and I'm meeting the people who are building. I'm talking to people who are actually doing creative stuff. And so alongside my research and writing, I did have a respect and built an affinity for a lot of what I saw happening in the industry. Started consulting a little bit, but I would say the biggest, shift for me happened a few years ago. And this relates to your podcast and privacy, how I got, focused on that. I was doing research. I was doing think tank research for the Center for a New American Security a few years ago. And I was doing research on China's digital currency, China's CBDC, the ECNY, digital yuan. And I wrote 2 reports on it. And the last report, it switched me. I shouldn't say it switched me. I had a realization. Because that report, and it wasn't an alarmist report. I wasn't trying to say, all the bad things about what the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is doing. But it was it was a very well vetted, well-researched document or report on what was being built in China and the state of the digital economy there. And really the conclusion I came to was that as China was becoming more digitally focused, more invested in digital infrastructure, you could see that really the only way this could go is to really give the state more authority and more control. And I reflected and I said, well, we're also here in the US, here in the West, we're also getting more digital. I mean, we're not becoming more, we're not going towards the digital path, whether it's financially, whether it's with consumerism. And so it became very clear to me that for us to maintain, the Fourth Amendment, the sort of principles of liberty and privacy, there's going to have to be in the United States and elsewhere innovation around privacy protection, because you can't just if you go all digital and everything is recorded, you have to have something to counter that. And I actually became much more interested in privacy preserving technology, not as an illicit finance risk, like some people, were talking about it, but really as something that could be a strategic benefit for national security and also just something that society needs to develop. And as I looked around, that sort of led me eventually to Aleo, to the Aleo network and to the Aleo Foundation, where I'm global head of policy. So that's a short story of how I got here.
Interesting. So, I mean, we've heard over the years many debates about privacy, but normally it was from the point of view of, you just gave an example of the CCP but normally the enemy, so to speak, was kind of big tech, wasn't it? In the old days, that they were the ones that were kind of intruding on privacy, or the government was intruding on privacy. Now we have sort of a new set of problems around blockchains where the threat is actually we have blockchains that are established or regulated, and particularly with the Genius Act, Stablecoin Act. But that creates another sort of problem, that the actual blockchain itself is too public, right? It's too transparent. So how did you kind of go from that kind of wider lens on privacy to this kind of new lens on privacy, which is about basically fixing blockchains, right?
Well, because it starts with what you alluded to, which is transparency on blockchains is a feature, not a bug, right? We know why the transparency is good for auditability. That's how blockchains have been made. But as you pointed out, but then if we're talking about privacy, total transparency, where every transaction is recorded for all time, forwards, backwards, you can always see this. That is a risk to privacy. And the interesting thing that I started to think about is, well, where is a lot of the privacy technology happening? You take something like, and I don't know if we need to go into details about zero knowledge proofs. Your audience understands ZKPs, but if you think about it, ZKPs were a research topic, decades ago, but it's really in crypto over the past decade where zero knowledge proofs actually started to get, actualized and used. And so it's interesting that because blockchains are publicly viewable, everything is exposed, the innovation around, well, how can we address that and provide confidentiality? That has evolved in crypto. So I've gone from, again, becoming interested in blockchain technology, what it has to offer, then seeing, okay, the risk around authoritarianism, looking now at blockchains and saying, well, okay, so blockchains are great, but there's this exposure problem. So how do you address that? And you can address it through blockchains that build privacy in by default. And that's what excites me. That's why I just really got into what's happening here. And especially, like you said, the Genius Act, right? And I'm sure on your podcast, you've talked about it. The Genius Act, which is a year old as of, this July, it's a year old. The Genius Act was like it was truly a milestone in that now the crypto killer app is acknowledged, right? But back in the day, people used to say crypto has no killer app. Slowly, stablecoins became that killer app. Now no one says what's the killer app of crypto, because probably it's stablecoins. And when that act passed, when it became law here in the United States, it became clear that now stablecoins weren't going to be just some little niche thing. Stablecoins were going to be mainstream. There's going to be now the ability to do settlements, do payments. And the one thing, though, that policymakers didn't really think about about and Genius does not really address is this transparency, exposure, and privacy risk issue. And that, I think, is the next, that's probably the next set of policy questions, or the next set of policy questions is going to revolve around privacy and confidentiality, and how do we have these networks to build on if everything is exposed. That's going to be a problem that has to be solved.
Right. So one reason we wanted to have you on the podcast is to talk about this stablecoin white paper you just produced, which is very good. I was reading it this morning. And I thought one of the interesting things in that report was that you talked about kind of older generation of privacy technology. I'm thinking particularly of mixers that we kind of, some of us know, like Tornado Cash. It's kind of controversial topic. Permission networks and also privacy tokens themselves, that would be Zcash or Monero. And you talk about some problems with some of those technologies. Do you want to just talk about that and how it maybe raised suspicions amongst policymakers about the intent of this privacy tech?
And I'll even zoom out further, because, yes, there's suspicion around some of this and how they use, but it's often dual use, right? Even if there are problems with mixers, or, it's not that they're all bad. I mean, you can use them for legitimate reasons. But what I would point out is that what the white paper is showing is that in order to get mainstream adoption means you're going to need to have institutional adoption. And in order to have wide scale adoption, you do have to deal with illicit finance risk, which some of these approaches don't fully address, or at least not enough for an institution. And so, mixers, which have been used, this probably was the first invention in crypto to try to deal with this exposure issue. But it's almost like a formula. If you have obfuscation plus high liquidity, then, it's good for someone that wants to, obscure the path. That's a good guy or a bad guy, right? And so you're going to attract illicit actors, and a lot of these mixers cannot fully account for that, at least not in a way that an institution, a big institution that's regulated, is going to be comfortable with. So again, it doesn't mean that they don't have their use. Privacy coins, similar. I mean, I'm for privacy coins. I'm not someone to say, the privacy coins should be banned or they're off limits. No, it's just like you have cash. I mean, cash allows, anonymous transactions. It can't be tracked in the same way. But we don't get rid of cash. We just understand that they're a risk and they have their role. Cash can't do everything. Similar with privacy coins. I think privacy coins, are important to our sort of financial ecosystem, I would actually say, in the digital realm. But there's still some limitations. And then, there's some approaches like permission networks, right? Where you sort of build like a walled garden, and that may work for some players, but then you lose that permissionlessness that we know is very important. So what we get at with this paper, Stablecoin Privacy, that I was really honored to co-author with Valerie Lila Jaber, who's a former Coinbase compliance ex-lead, and Matt Green, who a lot of your folks will know, the cryptographer, Hopkins professor,
the one and only.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Matt Green. I mean, so the paper basically says, okay, there is an approach that's going to meet the needs of institutions and wider adoption with stablecoins, which is you can't have you can't have all the data out available to any blockchain browser. There has to be a way to have confidential transactions associated with the stablecoin. And what that paper does is it lays it out. And I think it lays it out in a way that's digestible. You don't have to be Matt Green to read the paper. You can be Yaya Fanusie. It's written for a policymaker to break down what a private stablecoin infrastructure looks like. Specifically, it's this is from the perspective of Aleo, but it lays it out in a very sort of universal way for people to see, I can actually have privacy and manage risk.
Yeah, it's a great paper, and I'd highly recommend to read it. So you have obviously go through the solutions that Aleo is offering to continue to have what looks like a permissionless blockchain, i.e. a blockchain that we all know and love, but with these privacy controls to ensure people can make private transactions, and then also have some auditability if things go wrong in the background, right? Yeah. So How are you balancing these different things to keep
Mhm.
the regulators happy, but also to have these private transactions?
So the way I like to say it, explain it is that the infrastructure has building blocks for to manage risk. So to maybe walk through exactly how it works. Number one, everyone needs to understand that Aleo itself, as a chain, right, as an L1, is a private by default chain. So the infrastructure that we're talking about it's really a smart contract built on top of Aleo, where you have a stablecoin. So let's say you have your USDC, you're able to send your USDC into a smart contract, deposit location, where you're then able to mint a token that is backed by your USDC. But now this, it's minted on Aleo, so now it has the privacy features. So now you hold that token backed by your USDC, and now you can transact, privacy. Those transactions, the amount, the sender, recipient, they're not on a public blockchain. So to get at your question, well, what are the controls? So what had to be developed would be some things to manage risk. One, there is an asset view key. And this is something that is going to be important, or is important for an institution that says, okay, I want to build on this infrastructure. I want to use this for payments. So the asset view key is basically there's an address where every private transaction emits a compliance record and sends an encrypted compliance record to this address. So this address is able, the holder of this address has a key that can decrypt those compliance records. What it is, yes, it's a view key that should be held by a third party that has the ability to look at a transaction. Now, it's not public, but that third party can look at it, and that third party can monitor those transactions. So that's one key thing. And then there's another thing that's built in, which is a freeze list, and that's built into how the transactions operate. Because the freeze list, the reason why this is important is, if you're a regulated entity, especially if you think about the Genius Act, the Genius Act requires that the stablecoin issuer can do some things to mitigate risk, to be able to freeze. I mean, that's something that stablecoin issuers have to do. So you had to build an environment where they can still operate in a similar way. So that freeze list is checked, and it's a public freeze list. It's public, and you can see what's on it. But before the transaction happens, the sender is sort of a freeze list is checked. So that if there is, let's say, OFAC sanction, that list could be updated. And that's something that law enforcement regulators are going to look for. Now, I say that with with the idea that, again, building blocks. This is, these are important measures that have to be, that have to be in place. But, there could be variations. There could be more that could be built on, depending on an institution that wants to build more or do something else. But these are key components that at least allow for some measure of risk management.
So what would you say to a cypherpunk who would now say, isn't that just a backdoor into the blockchain? You're not really offering privacy if you're offering this view key functionality.
Every use case requires a different set of controls or lack thereof. The use case of, hey, I just want to do a private transaction, like I said before, you have private tokens. That exists. No one is getting rid of that. The Aleo native token is a private token where you can totally do, without compromising, a private transaction. You can keep your, transaction private. There are other tokens that are similar. My response would be, for there to be adoption of stablecoins, you're going to have some measure of control like this. And, maybe one way to think about it, and maybe the cypherpunk won't like me saying this, but in a sense, we're talking here about bank level privacy with what I described, in the sense that when you transact, the general public, when they transact, they do know that there's a third party that does have access, that that can look at their transactions. That's with every credit card, right? That exists. But you do know the privacy that we're talking about there is that it's not publicly exposed. And so what this is doing is it's enabling blockchains to be able to have that same sort of usage for folks that want that, and for institutions that are going to need that. So it's not an either or, and it's not a you're not talking about the government having unfettered access. What you're talking about is, the same sort of restrictions and legal processes that law enforcement would have to go to, to go to an exchange or to go to, a stablecoin issuer. That would still be in place. It's really not different. It's not a willy-nilly, anyone can see it. And this is where stablecoin issuers have to sort of set those standards for, or, set the processes for what do they do when they get a law enforcement request and how's that handled. But at least the good thing is that, it's zero knowledge proof. So you don't have to give everything. There's a way to just disclose what's necessary for that inquiry.
Right. I'm just wondering, while we're talking about illicit finance, that maybe we could just talk about how big a problem with this is, because people throw around a lot of numbers and stuff. And I just wondered, as an expert, how in dollar terms, how big is the illicit finance problem? And for a network like Aleo, how big a sort of risk is it that somebody might use the network for an illicit transaction?
Yeah, it's funny because you said, as an expert, and you know what? Every time over the years, in briefing Congress, media interviews, when people want to get into the numbers, and this is me not in industry, this is when I was on the outside,
Right.
looking at illicit finance, I never dealt with the numbers because I think that can be misleading. People can, there's, people can do whatever they want with statistics. I'm forgetting the funny quote. But generally speaking, I mean, I actually have done, I did some early research back in 2017, 2018 about this, where it's pretty clear that, the percentage is relatively small now, but I try not to focus on that because as someone who worked in national security, you don't want to dismiss. So I don't want to ever dismiss illicit finance. Illicit finance is bad. You don't want it in TradFi. You don't want it in crypto. So that to me is that's the thing. We don't want it, and so we want to do things to make sure the ecosystem is. We want to minimize that. So it's not that. But the issue though is that illicit finance is, like crime, is a risk. So you can't ignore it and you can't act like it doesn't exist. What you have to do is what's within your power to sort of build a system that, does not invite that or try to encourage the illicit use. And so one way I like to think about it is, there's already illicit use out in the world. With this private stablecoin infrastructure, I think the objective that I'm looking for is that you want to make sure that you have such controls so that people aren't attracted to illicit actors aren't attracted to go into your environment more than they are on the outside.
Right.
Because you can there's already plenty of ways to be anonymous or, to use mixers. All of that exists. And I think what this does is it allows an environment for privacy where for an illicit actor to come in and say, okay, I'm going to take advantage of the Aleo privacy, use a stablecoin there. I think that illicit actor is going to see, well, you know what? There's actually some checks and balances here. So it's a more hostile environment for the illicit actor than they would use going outside. Doesn't mean you can eliminate, no one can eliminate illicit finance, but what you want to do is just disincentivize exploitation, because once illicit actors and crypto fans, I shouldn't say crypto fan, but in the crypto space, right? We're so familiar with, there could be a platform once illicit actors sort of exploit it so much where they're making millions and millions and millions of dollars, it attracts attention. Automatically, regulators, law enforcement, it creates a stigma. So you have to do something so that you're not just wholesale attracting more negative attention. And I have to say, because people talk about crypto and like this is a crypto thing. If you're in TradFi, I mean, if there's a bank that, of course, people always say, well, banks do illicit finance too. They do. But guess what? If a bank becomes widely, a bank is going to get an enforcement action. It's going to get some, depending on what, the level, if there is a significant illicit activity, the government will go after that bank. And so I'm not trying to equate banks with a blockchain, but I am saying that the general principle, is the same, that you don't want to attract, you want to disincentivize people from putting illicit funds on your platform.
Right. So it's about having a deterrent as well as having those preventative measures themselves.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, just want to move on because we don't have too much time.
Yeah.
Just looking at the kind of bigger policy picture here, obviously we've got the Genius Act. We talked about, problem there with privacy. What about the Clarity Act? Does that have any relevance to the privacy debates? And if we think that's going to pass or not pass, what would then come down the pike after that might address some of these privacy issues that we want to see?
So I will actually say, I mean, well, I don't know what to say about clarity because we don't know when this is going to come out, right? So so things with
Yeah,
clarity as of the time we're filming are up in the air, and depends on who you ask. I'm hopeful, but we'll see.
yeah,
I actually would say it's not going to be within clarity that the privacy issue is going to be addressed the most, because clarity is doing something different. It's providing, yeah, as clear rules to classify tokens, and so it's not it's the privacy issue is sort of a not next generation, but it's sort of the secondary policy issue, which I think we're going to see more in 2027. And the best
yeah,
example way I can show that is with the Genius Act itself. So Genius Act right now in 2026, you're seeing all this rulemaking from the different agencies, the financial regulatory agencies. They're all doing the rulemaking, which sort of, provides the details of everything that Genius sort of said. 2026, all of those things are happening. But very few of those rulemaking initiatives address privacy. And so what is going to have to happen, and what is happening now, some of our team at the Aleo Network Foundation have done this, is we actually have to point to regulators what they're going to have to do with maybe a next set of rulemaking, because the initial rulemaking is just, even with clarity, it's just going to be about, okay, classifying, instituting those rules. The privacy issue is a little bit more fine-tuned, and I'll give you a perfect example. This is something that came up in recent months. So the OCC, one of the banking regulators, they had a rulemaking, and the rulemaking was about how to implement the Genius Act and all the different things that are required. There was one question, I think, in their rulemaking that they were asking for comment about privacy. And so, our response to that question was, guess what, OCC, as part of your authority and your oversight, you have to secure the privacy you have to make sure that institutions are safeguarding privacy. Well, what you don't realize, I'm just sort of paraphrasing, right, in a layman's way, what we said. Well, what you have to think about is blockchain transparency. Now you may have to redefine non-public information, because before, what's on a blockchain is public information, like
right.
technically according to their definition. So what we had to point out was that you may need to redefine or add some nuance to this idea of non-public information, because now people's transactions are going to be exposed. So right. What's going to have to happen is maybe a new set of rulemaking that'll happen after Genius is fully implemented. Regulators are going to have to think about, all this stuff that we have in play. Now, how do we safeguard consumer privacy? And this is where, Aleo, Maiden, those of us who've been following privacy, we have to kind of get ready to start telling regulators now, you have to start doing this. The conversation around privacy is no longer going to be about the illicit finance mixer's good, mixer bad. That's so 2019. That's so 2022, I should see. That's so from the Tornado Cash 2022. That's an old conversation. The new conversation, even U.S. Treasury recognizes that mixers have legitimate use. So it's a new day in 2026. What's going to be needed is the people who care about privacy, who are building protocols, who are doing all of this, are going to have to start looking at the regulation. Not that, we're against it, but no, we're going to have to say, we may need to adjust this, because guess what? We have privacy preserving protocols. We have privacy preserving tools built on blockchains, and we need to account for that. So I actually think we're at a more mature place with industry and regulators. Not to say there's not going to be, tension and, all of that still exists. We're in free societies. There's going to be tension. But I'm actually impressed, because compared to when I started looking at this from an illicit finance, national security perspective in 2017 and 18, we're at a very much more mature place.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So, I mean, some people have been saying that maybe there'll be changes to even the BSA, the Bank Secrecy Act, or even, the KYC regime. There's kind of a lot of questions around that and privacy out there. So do you see
Yeah.
that happening?
Well, I don't want to get everyone's hopes up, but I will say I do see baby steps. But remember, this is government. And this is, especially when you talk about the BSA, you're talking about the US government and Treasury. Here's the good news. The good news is where we are now is almost, it feels like light years compared to where we were 3 years ago. Because 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I remember I was part of multiple roundtable conversations in DC at different think tanks. And I remember I probably moderated a roundtable about the future of the BSA. How does the BSA work? And usually the conversation was one side of the table saying, gut it all, throw away the BSA. We don't need the BSA. We don't need no stinking KYC. And the other side saying, well, no, it's always going to have to be this. But some things have changed and there's still the tension. But, what people were saying years ago, people would always point out, you could do digital ID and you could do all these different things. You could have verified credentials and decentralized ID. That was very theoretical 3 or 4 years ago. Now in crypto, maybe it was, practical. But for regulators, it was like, you guys are talking about Star Trek space age stuff and we're trying to just, regulate the financial system. But now you actually do see where Treasury is thinking more about digital ID. There's some, very, like I say, baby steps. There are things that show that even the regulators are that even though regulators are still trying to maintain the system, they are asking questions about how to do some alternative ways of verifying identity. So it's not going to be what the cypherpunk totally wants. It's not going to be what the privacy maximalist wants right now, but I say baby steps because once you do start introducing different types of credentials, digital ID, then you can sort of legitimize different ways of doing things. And down the line, you could potentially change the BSA. But people just have to remember, the regulatory framework isn't going to change based on a few pioneering projects, or it's going to have to be that, okay, wow, we see this stuff is getting used. It really makes sense because to change the AML framework, that's a huge deal. So it's not going to happen right away, but I do think we're trending in a direction where there's the ability to make some good change.
That's great to hear. I mean, it's interesting that that's one of the legacies maybe of crypto to open these type of conversations, that it might not be actually for crypto, but it might be the start of a conversation around these bigger issues.
Yeah, and that's where crypto has made its mark.
Okay, everybody, that was Yaya Fanusie. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Ben. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, thanks again for listening to the Privacy Podcast with Maiden. I just wanted to have a shout out to Michelle Musso, who produces the podcast with Musso Media. She does a great job. And we'll see you next time on the Privacy Podcast with more interviews with privacy pioneers. Have a good week.